Straight into the news out of the sector today, because there's been a huge fortnight of announcements by the Gillard government in the area of social business. Peter Shergold, the big one, I guess, was the commitment of $3.7 billion over 10 years for aged care services. What have you garnered as the response from the sector?
Look, I'd have to say the response from the sector, the not-for-profit sector generally, has been very positive, whether you're looking at the Council of the Ageing or Aged Care Australia or Dementia Australia, Carers Australia. Very positive. I think there's a lot of support for the emphasis on trying to allow people to be given support to stay at home as long as possible, rather than going into aged care facilities. I mean, that's cost effective. It's also good for the people in question. A lot of support for more equitable funding, a lot of support for the fact that the government's going to invest in the training of aged care workers and into a dementia package. So on all of that, you know, the first response, I emphasise, the first response has been really positive.
I guess the ageing population places a great demand on the economy, on the finances of the country as well. Do you think the funding now is adequate enough to address that demand?
Well, I think that's the big question.
Yeah.
Is the funding going to be sufficient? When the Productivity Commission brought down its report, it was saying that the family home should be included in the assets in terms of what people might contribute towards their aged care. The government, for very understandable political reasons, has said, no, we're not going to go down that. But the question still remains is, will the funding from individuals and from government be sufficient to give us the aged care that Australia wants, given, of course, the huge demographic shifts that are going on?
And you're saying we haven't quite discovered that yet?
Well, we haven't, and if you get behind even the $3.7 billion, it's clear that, you know, most of it is not new money. And if you look at it, as so often, when you hear the announcement, but you find that, in fact, most of the funding comes in the third, fourth, fifth years rather than up front.
Peter, also the introduction of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, we've heard that will actually be brought forward.
Well, we've heard that, but what does it actually mean? Because you hear, first of all, it's going to be brought forward. What's going to be brought forward is that we will lay the foundations for this scheme. And so it's always trying to find out what is the reality here. Clearly, there is support, and at the Council of Australian Governments there was agreement on the principles that would underlie the disability insurance scheme, which is great. Can I tell you from experience what will now happen? There will be very difficult negotiations between the Commonwealth and the state jurisdictions, and often undertaken by public servants, to think, well, what does that agreement in principle mean? How actually are we going to share the financial and administrative responsibility? That's the tricky bit, which will need to be undertaken before we can lay the foundations for the scheme.
Sure. Let's get to some of the other outcomes from COAG. One of them being the new not-for-profit working group, Peter. So what's this in charge of?
How many working groups and committees and councils have we talked about? I'm glad we got our guest today, because he might be able to help make sense of this. But if you think about it, we've got various committees looking at the charitable status, at tax concessions, at, you know, of course, the establishment of the new regulator in October, the Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission, inquiries into reducing red tape and making reporting easier, harmonising legislation. The difficulty for an outsider is seeing how all these bits are actually going to fit together.
Yeah, sure. We will get to our guests in just a second, but there's also been a couple of reports on the state of the not-for-profit sector, one in Australia but also in the UK. There's a kind of a worrying picture being painted by those.
Yeah, they're different. The one in Australia, done by Connecting Up, is looking at the extent to which not-for-profit organisations and charities are actually making use of their IT and particular social media. What it finds is that half of them don't even have the money to provide the training to their people, and they estimate that only about 5% of charities are actually using social media as part of their fundraising and marketing. The one in the UK, which was done by PwC, is more worrying. What it really shows, I think this is the fourth, perhaps fifth inquiry there's been, they do it annually. What they've actually shown is that 93% of the not-for-profit charities in the UK are finding fundraising harder over the last 12 months. About two-thirds of them are finding government spending cuts are making it tougher. And here's the crunch. I mean, not-for-profit organisations on the whole resist M&A. They're not strong in mergers. But in fact, you've got a fifth of UK not-for-profits now saying they may have to consider mergers in order to be able to survive. It's a quite bleak picture.